Constantinople, around the year 565 AD. A cold wind from the Bosphorus cuts to the bone, carrying the smell of salt, fish, and city damp. At the massive marble gates, through which triumphal columns and captive kings once passed, an old man sits on the icy stone slabs. His clothes are filthy rags, his beard is matted and gray. But the most terrifying thing is his eyes, or rather, their absence. Where his eyes should be, there are only hollows of burned, scarred tissue, an eternal darkness forced upon him by human cruelty. With a trembling, withered hand, he holds out a crude wooden bowl to passers-by, and his lifeless yet still deep voice utters a phrase that has become legendary. Date obolum Belisario. Give an obol to Belisarius. This name, like a thunderclap from the past, makes some hurry on, while others stop in silent disbelief. Belisarius, a name that, just 30 years earlier, had thundered from Persia to Spain. Belisarius, conqueror of the Vandals and the Goths, savior of Rome, defender of Constantinople. The man who laid entire continents at the feet of Emperor Justinian, who paraded the chained Vandal king, Gelimer, through the streets of the capital in a triumph, an honor no general who was not an emperor had received in over 500 years. How could this titan, this military genius, this last of the true Romans, end up here, on the church steps, a blind, forgotten beggar, pleading for alms from the descendants of those he once saved? This question is not merely a biographical puzzle. It is a profound paradox of power and loyalty, of glory and ingratitude that echoes through the centuries. To find the answer, we must return to the very beginning, to a world that desperately needed a hero, and having found one, ultimately could not bear his greatness. To understand the tragedy of Belisarius, one must first understand the world into which he was born, a world of broken mirrors, where each shard still remembered the former glory of Rome, but could no longer reflect it whole. The 6th century AD was an age of profound fracture. The Western Roman Empire, a colossus that had stood for 1,000 years, had collapsed less than half a century earlier under the blows of barbarian tribes. On its ruins, a patchwork of warring kingdoms had emerged: the Vandals in wealthy North Africa, the Ostrogoths in the sacred heart of the former empire, Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul. The eternal city of Rome, once the capital of the world, had been plundered multiple times and had become a provincial town, a shadow of its former self. But in the east, in the impregnable, glittering city of Constantinople, the empire had survived. Byzantium, as historians would later call it, still considered itself the one true Roman Empire, and its ruler the only legitimate emperor of the entire Roman world. On the throne at this time sat Justinian I, a man of humble origins but limitless ambition. He was obsessed with an idea that would become the leitmotif of his entire reign: Renovatio Imperii, the great restoration of the empire. He dreamed not just of defending the remaining borders, but of reclaiming the lost western provinces, of reconquering Rome, Carthage, and Ravenna, of washing away the shame of past defeats and reuniting the Mediterranean under one emperor and one law. It was a dream of a purple rebirth, a grand and almost insane vision. But for such a dream, he needed more than an administrator or a lawmaker. He needed a sword, an ideal general, combining the courage of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, and the discipline of Scipio. Justinian, sitting in his magnificent palace, considered the names of his generals, but none matched the scale of the task. The world was in a fragile balance, and a genius was needed to tip the scales of history. And that genius was already coming of age in the harsh, windswept lands of the Balkans. Belisarius was not born to the purple. His story is not a saga of a crown prince, but an epic of a self-made man forged from raw material. He was born around the year 500 in Germone, a small settlement in Thrace or Illyria, the very Balkan lands that for centuries had supplied Rome with its finest soldiers and sternest emperors. His family was likely Romanized, Latin-speaking, but did not belong to the senatorial aristocracy of Constantinople. He was a provincial, an outsider, and this fact would define his entire destiny. In a world where nobility and connections decided everything, Belisarius had to rely solely on his own talents. He had no powerful clan or ancient wealth behind him. His only capital was his mind, his courage, and his loyalty. From a young age, he chose a military career, the only path of social mobility for a man of his standing. He began his service in the personal guard of the future Emperor Justinian, while he was still heir to the throne. It was there, in daily service, that he caught his master's eye. Justinian, himself from a humble background, valued effectiveness in people, not pedigree. In the young Thracian, he saw what he was looking for: iron discipline, a sharp intellect, and most importantly, boundless devotion. This master-servant bond became the foundation of their relationship. For Belisarius, Justinian was not just an emperor, but the very embodiment of the idea of Rome, a living symbol of legitimate authority that he was prepared to serve to his last drop of blood. This initial dynamic, a brilliant but dependent general and an all-powerful but needy emperor, created the forces that would lead to the greatest victories and the most bitter tragedy. Belisarius was the perfect instrument, but his very perfection would, in time, inspire fear in the one who held him. Unlike Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, whose births and fates were shrouded in myths and prophecies, history has preserved no legends of omens accompanying the arrival of Belisarius. Yet, looking at his life, it seems the era itself was one great prophecy demanding his appearance. In the 6th century, the very idea of being Roman was undergoing a profound crisis. It no longer meant being born in Italy or speaking the perfect Latin of Cicero. It was becoming a matter of spirit, culture, and above all, loyalty to the empire. And it was in this sense that his contemporaries and posterity would call Belisarius Ultimus Romanorum, the last of the true Romans. This was not a title, but a statement of fact. In him, a Thracian commoner, they saw the resurrection of ancient Roman virtues, austerity, discipline, a disdain for luxury, strategic thinking, and most importantly, absolute submission to one's duty to the state. He was like a character who had stepped out of the pages of Livy, finding himself in the pampered and treacherous world of the Byzantine court. While the capital's aristocracy drowned in intrigues and theological disputes, Belisarius thought in terms of legions, logistics, and tactics. He was a man of action in a world of words, a man of honor in a world of backroom deals. This nickname, the Last Roman, also carried a shadow of tragedy. To be the last is to be alone, misunderstood. His value system, his ideas of duty and honor, were already an anachronism for Justinian's court, where personal loyalty to the emperor was valued more than abstract loyalty to the state, and a subject's success was often seen as a potential threat to the throne. Thus, his greatness was also his curse. He was too Roman for his time, and it was this clash between his inner code of honor and the political reality of the age that would become one of the key factors predetermining his tragic end. The future genius's youth was not only the forge of his military talent, but also the stage where the most important and, as it turned out, most fateful alliance of his life was made. This was his marriage to Antonina. This woman was no simple matron. She came from a family of chariot racers and actresses, a circle considered almost marginal in Byzantine society. But she possessed a sharp mind, an iron will, and most importantly, was the closest friend and confidant of the Empress Theodora herself. Theodora, a former actress who became the most powerful woman in the empire, surrounded herself with people from her own background, whom she could trust implicitly. The marriage of Belisarius, the rising star of the army, to Antonina, the Empress's protégée, was not just a union of two hearts, but a finely calculated political contract. For Belisarius, it was a pass to the very center of power, into the intimate circle of the imperial couple. He gained direct access to the monarch's ears and a powerful patron in Theodora. But this alliance had a dark side. Antonina was a domineering woman, prone to intrigue, and, as malicious tongues, like Procopius of Caesarea, claim in his Secret History, unfaithful. She was Theodora's eyes and ears in Belisarius's home and on his campaigns. Through her, the Empress could not only receive information, but also exert direct influence over the general, and at times, even manipulate him. This marriage placed Belisarius in a dual position. On one hand, he was protected from many court enemies who feared Theodora's wrath. On the other, he was enmeshed in a web of female intrigues that often conflicted with his direct and honest soldier's view of the world. A great strategist, capable of commanding tens of thousands of warriors on the battlefield, he often found himself helpless before the will of his wife, behind whom stood the will of the Empress herself. This union, which gave him so much at the start of his career, would ultimately become one of the sources of his weakness and humiliation, proving that the most dangerous battles are sometimes fought not on fields of war, but in the silence of palace chambers. The name of Belisarius first thundered across the empire in the year 530, on the far eastern borders, where Byzantium was waging an exhausting war with its eternal enemy, Sassanid Persia. Not yet 30 years old, he was entrusted with command of the army of the East. The Persians, confident in their numerical superiority, advanced with a huge army of up to 40,000 warriors, led by their best commanders. Belisarius had no more than 25,000 soldiers. Anyone else in his place would have retreated or prepared for a heroic but doomed defense. But Belisarius demonstrated what would become his trademark, a tactical genius capable of turning weakness into strength. Near the town of Dara, he chose his position and ordered his soldiers to dig a complex system of trenches. This protected his infantry center and flanks, but left room for cavalry counterattacks. It was an innovative solution that the Persian commanders, accustomed to standard field battles, simply could not decipher. When the Persian army, including their elite cavalry, the Immortals, charged, they became bogged down in the Roman defensive formations. Their ranks fell into disarray, and the attack faltered. At that very moment, Belisarius unleashed his own cavalry, which slammed into the enemy's flanks. The Persian army, invincible in a frontal assault, was unprepared for such a maneuver. Panic set in, turning into a full-scale rout. The victory was total and devastating. The Romans suffered negligible losses, while the Persians lost many thousands. The Battle of Dara was not just a military victory. It was a demonstration of a new style of warfare, based not on brute force, but on intellect, discipline, and psychological pressure. Belisarius proved to Justinian that he was not just another brave commander, but a strategist on the level of Alexander and Hannibal. This victory made his name known throughout the empire, transforming him from a promising general into Justinian's greatest military hope. It was after Dara that the emperor realized he had found the very sword with which he could realize his dream of restoration. Behind every great deed lies an equally great motivation. And to understand why Belisarius performed his feats and why he ultimately fell so low, we must look into the very essence of his character, his inner world. His main driving force, his alpha and omega, was not a thirst for power, not a desire for wealth, not even personal glory. Though he was certainly ambitious, his inner demon, his secret and all-consuming passion, was an absolute, almost religious loyalty. But this was not simply loyalty to a man, to Emperor Justinian. It was loyalty to an idea, the idea of an eternal and indivisible Roman Empire. For him, a provincial who grew up on the edge of the civilized world, Constantinople and its emperor were not just a capital and a ruler, but sacred symbols of order, law, and greatness in a world descending into barbarian chaos. He served not so much Justinian as what Justinian represented. This fanatical devotion was the source of his incredible strength. It allowed him to reject temptations that no other commander of his era would have resisted. When the Goths in Italy offered him the crown of the Western Roman Empire, he refused without hesitation, considering the very thought a betrayal. He would endure humiliations from the court, shortages of soldiers and money, and the intrigues of his wife, because his personal pride always came second to his duty to the empire. But it was this greatest of virtues, taken to an absolute, that would become his tragic flaw. He did not understand, or did not want to understand, that the world had changed. That for Justinian and his circle, the empire was no longer a republican ideal of service, but the personal property of the emperor. His loyalty was too pure, too straightforward for the winding corridors of Byzantine politics. He didn't know how to weave intrigues. He didn't form his own political faction at court. He didn't try to protect himself by securing the support of influential senators. He simply served. And therein lay his tragedy. He was the perfect servant. But his master, being human, could not help but feel fear and envy towards such a perfect and popular instrument of his will. His loyalty prevented him from betraying, but it also left him defenseless against betrayal. Returning from the Persian frontier as a hero, Belisarius soon faced a trial far more terrifying than any enemy army. In January of 532, the Nika Revolt erupted in Constantinople. It began as a riot in the Hippodrome between the fan factions, the Blues and the Greens, but quickly escalated into a full-scale rebellion against Justinian's tax policies and autocracy. The entire city was in flames. The mob, chanting, "Nika! Conquer!" burned half the capital, including the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, and proclaimed a new emperor. Justinian was in despair. The palace was under siege, and the guard was wavering. At an emergency council, the broken and terrified emperor was already preparing to flee. He ordered treasures to be gathered and ships to be readied. It seemed his reign was about to end in disgrace. And at that moment, two events saved the throne. First, Empress Theodora gave her famous speech, declaring that purple makes the finest shroud, and that she would not leave the capital alive. Her words inspired courage in the shaken emperor. And then, Belisarius stepped in. Along with another general, Mundus, he was ordered to crush the rebellion at any cost. It was an almost suicidal mission. They had only a few thousand loyal soldiers against hundreds of thousands of enraged rioters. But Belisarius acted with icy composure and absolute ruthlessness. He divided his forces and, using his knowledge of the city streets, launched a surprise attack on the crowd gathered in the Hippodrome for the coronation of their false emperor. The entrances to the Hippodrome were blocked. A horrific massacre began. The unarmed crowd, trapped in a stone cage, could offer no resistance. By evening, according to chroniclers, more than 30,000 corpses lay in the arena and on the stands. The revolt was drowned in blood. Belisarius had saved the empire and his emperor. He had proven his absolute loyalty and effectiveness. But the price of this victory was enormous. He had become not only a savior, but also an executioner. And though Justinian was immensely grateful, in the emperor's eyes, from that day forward, there was not only admiration, but also fear of a man capable of annihilating tens of thousands of his subjects with such cold-blooded determination. Having suppressed internal turmoil and solidified his power on mountains of corpses, Justinian realized that the energy of his brilliant and frightening general needed to be urgently directed outward. The ambitious project of Renovatio Imperii received a new impetus. The internal enemy was destroyed. Now it was time to crush external foes and reclaim what rightfully belonged to Rome. The first target chosen was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The choice was no accident. The African province, with its capital in ancient Carthage, was one of the wealthiest in the former Western Empire, its true breadbasket. Control over it would provide not only vast amounts of grain and tax revenue, but also a strategic advantage in the Western Mediterranean. Moreover, the Vandals, being Arian Christians, brutally persecuted the local Orthodox population, giving Justinian a perfect pretext for an invasion under the guise of protecting fellow believers. The Vandals themselves, once fearsome warriors, had grown soft during their century of rule in Africa, drowning in luxury and Roman comforts. Their fleet had decayed, and their army had lost its former discipline. Justinian deemed the moment perfect for a strike. However, the expedition was considered extremely risky. The sea voyage was long and dangerous, and the memory of a disastrously failed expedition in the 5th century was still fresh in many minds. Many advisors tried to dissuade the emperor from this venture. But Justinian, inspired by the determination of Belisarius, insisted. Command was given solely to Belisarius, who received almost unlimited authority. He was given a fleet of 500 ships and an army that was surprisingly small, just 10,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. With such modest forces, he was to cross the sea and challenge an entire kingdom. It was a huge risk, but also a chance for immortal glory. Belisarius, true to his nature, accepted the challenge without hesitation, setting his sights on the west in pursuit of the shadow of the Roman eagle, which he was to restore to African lands. What happened in North Africa in the autumn of 533 has entered all textbooks of military art as a model of a brilliantly planned and lightning-fast campaign. Belisarius, landing on the coast with an army significantly smaller than that of the Vandals, showed the world his unique tactical genius, a blend of audacity, discipline, and subtle psychology. He knew he could not afford a protracted war, so he staked everything on speed and decisiveness. Immediately upon landing, he gave the strictest orders. Do not plunder or oppress the local Romanized population. His soldiers paid for provisions and behaved as liberators, not conquerors. This move instantly paid off. Cities opened their gates to him, and local inhabitants provided all kinds of support, supplying his army with food and information. The Vandal king, Gelimer, caught by surprise, acted indecisively. He tried to set an ambush at Ad Decimum, but due to poor coordination, his plan failed. Belisarius crushed the Vandal vanguard and then their main forces. The path to Carthage was open. The capital of the Vandal kingdom was taken without a fight. Belisarius entered the city not as a barbarian invader, but as a Roman consul, holding a feast in Gelimer's palace and sitting on his throne. Gelimer himself fled and tried to raise a new army. The decisive battle took place at Tricamarum. Again commanding smaller forces, Belisarius, thanks to the superior discipline of his cavalry and tactical cunning, utterly defeated the Vandals. Gelimer fled again, and was soon besieged in an impregnable mountain fortress. Broken and desperate, he surrendered a few months later. The entire campaign, from landing to complete victory, took less than half a year. A whole kingdom, which had existed for a century, was destroyed in a single, swift blitzkrieg. Belisarius didn't just win. He did so with minimal losses and stunning efficiency, returning one of its most valuable provinces to the empire. His fame spread throughout the Mediterranean, but it was the scale and ease of this victory that sowed the first seeds of future trouble. In the shadow of every great man stands a figure who shapes his image for posterity. For Belisarius, that figure was his personal secretary and historian, Procopius of Caesarea. The relationship between these two men was complex and multifaceted, and it is thanks to Procopius that we have such a detailed, yet contradictory, portrait of the general today. Procopius accompanied Belisarius on all his major campaigns in Africa, Italy, and Persia. He was an eyewitness to great battles and secret councils. In his official works, such as the Wars, he creates a virtually flawless image of Belisarius. He is a wise, brave, just, and unfailingly loyal commander, an ideal Roman hero. Procopius admires his strategic decisions, his ability to inspire soldiers, and his mercy towards the vanquished. If we only had these texts, Belisarius would remain in history as a one-dimensional poster hero, devoid of any flaws. However, after the deaths of all the main figures of his time, Procopius wrote a completely different work, The Secret History. It is a furious, venomous pamphlet in which he tears the masks off everyone he once praised. Justinian and Theodora are portrayed as demons incarnate, and the image of Belisarius changes drastically. From an ideal hero, he turns into a weak-willed, spineless man, completely subservient to his promiscuous and treacherous wife, Antonina. Procopius delightedly describes her affairs, her intrigues, her humiliating influence over her husband, who, he claims, knew everything but was afraid to oppose her because of her closeness to Empress Theodora. Which of these versions is true? The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. The official Wars is a panegyric written for the emperor's ears. The Secret History is an outburst of accumulated bile and resentment, possibly exaggerating the flaws of its subjects. But it is this dual legacy of Procopius that makes the image of Belisarius so three-dimensional and tragic. He shows us not only the facade of the hero, but also his inner turmoil, his personal dramas and humiliations that unfolded in his tent while he was redrawing the map of the world. Procopius was both the creator of his glory and the witness to his weakness. In the year 534, Belisarius returned to Constantinople, bringing with him not only a reconquered province, but also the captive Vandal king, Gelimer, along with his entire treasury. To celebrate this incredible victory, Justinian arranged something unthinkable, a triumph. According to a tradition established over many centuries, a triumphal procession through the capital was the exclusive privilege of emperors. The last time a general not wearing the purple had been granted. Such an honor was more than 500 years earlier, during the time of the Principate. Justinian's decision was a gesture of incredible generosity and recognition, but it also became a turning point in the relationship between the emperor and his general. This was the day of the absolute zenith of Belisarius's fame. He walked through the streets of the capital on foot, like an ancient republican commander, followed by the chained king Gelimer, who reportedly kept repeating words from Ecclesiastes, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." The procession ended at the Hippodrome, where Belisarius and Gelimer prostrated themselves before the box of Justinian and Theodora. The crowd roared with delight. The people idolized their hero. The soldiers adored their commander, who had led them to such an easy and rich victory. The Senate and the aristocracy, though gritting their teeth in envy of the provincial upstart, were forced to applaud. Belisarius was on top of the world, but it was on this peak that the first icy winds of the coming storm began to blow. Justinian, sitting in his box, saw not just a loyal servant, but a man whose popularity was beginning to eclipse his own. He heard the enthusiastic cheers of the crowd and understood that they were directed not at him, the emperor, but at his general. Rumors began to circulate that the soldiers in Africa had wanted to proclaim Belisarius emperor, and only his unbending loyalty had prevented a mutiny. For the paranoid mind of a Byzantine autocrat, this was enough. He rewarded Belisarius with a consulship and immense wealth, but in his soul, the cold seed of suspicion and envy had already taken root. The triumph, which should have been the crown of their union, in fact, became the beginning of its end. The glory of Belisarius had become too bright, and it began to cast a shadow on the throne itself. After the triumphal return of Africa to the imperial fold, Justinian's gaze, intoxicated by success, turned to the most precious jewel in the lost crown of the West, Italy. This land was not just a rich province, it was the heart, the cradle, and the symbol of Roman civilization. The return of Italy, and, most importantly, of Rome itself, would be the pinnacle of the Restoration Project, the final proof of the recovery of former greatness. The Ostrogoths, who ruled Italy, the heirs of Theodoric the Great, gave Justinian the perfect pretext to intervene. After Theodoric's death, internal strife began in their kingdom. His daughter, the regent Amalasuntha, who pursued a pro-Roman policy, was overthrown and killed by her cousin Theodahad. Justinian immediately declared himself the avenger of his ally's death and set his armies in motion. The man appointed to carry out this grand and seemingly impossible task was, of course, Belisarius. This time, however, the expedition was prepared in a completely different atmosphere. The success in Africa had bred a sense of giddiness and overconfidence at court. Belisarius was given an even smaller army than for the Vandal campaign, only about 7,500 soldiers. With these paltry forces, he was to challenge the mighty Gothic kingdom, whose army numbered tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of battle-hardened warriors. It was a venture bordering on madness, but Belisarius, the faithful soldier, accepted the order. In 535, he landed in Sicily, which he captured with almost no resistance. He then crossed to the mainland and began his legendary march into the heart of darkness, deep into enemy territory, where every step could be his last. The Gothic War had begun, a protracted, bloody, devastating struggle that would last for almost 2 decades and would become for Belisarius both the stage for his greatest achievements and the cause of his deepest suffering. The Italian campaign, which had begun so daringly, quickly turned into a brutal test of endurance. After taking Naples, Belisarius, with a small detachment, entered a Rome abandoned by the Goths. The return of the Eternal City to imperial rule after 60 years of barbarian dominion had colossal symbolic importance. But the military situation was desperate. Soon, a huge Gothic army under their new energetic king, Witiges, numbering up to 150,000 men by some accounts, arrived at the walls of Rome. Belisarius had no more than 5,000 soldiers to defend the gigantic perimeter of the walls. Thus began the Great Siege of Rome, which lasted for over a year, from 537 to 538. This was Belisarius's finest hour as a master of defense. He was everywhere, personally leading sorties, inspecting posts, encouraging soldiers exhausted by hunger and battle, and inventing new types of siege engines. He turned the city into an impregnable fortress, repelling one furious assault after another. His personal courage and unyielding will worked miracles. In the end, the Goths, having suffered enormous losses from combat and disease, were forced to lift the siege and retreat. It was an incredible victory of spirit over numbers. And it was at this moment, when Belisarius's fame reached its peak, that fate dealt him a treacherous blow. The Goths, defeated in open battle, decided to change tactics. Their chiefs, admiring the military genius and nobility of their enemy, secretly approached Belisarius with an incredible offer. They were ready to recognize him as their king and the emperor of the Western Roman Empire, betraying their own unsuccessful ruler, Witiges. A dizzying prospect opened before Belisarius. He could become a new Augustus, restore the Western Empire, and rule it as he saw fit. Anyone else in his place would have seized the chance. But Belisarius was the last Roman. He rejected the offer with contempt. However, the very fact of these negotiations, reported to Constantinople by spies and rivals, was the last straw for Justinian. The emperor became finally convinced that his general had become too popular and dangerous. After the siege of Rome was lifted, the war entered a new phase. Belisarius, having received small reinforcements, went on the counter-offensive, pushing the Goths further and further north. The final objective was Ravenna, the impregnable, swamp-surrounded capital of the Gothic kingdom, where King Witiges had taken refuge with his last forces. The siege of Ravenna could have dragged on for years. And then Belisarius decided on the riskiest and, as it turned out, most fateful move of his career. Knowing of the offer the Goths had previously made him, he decided to use it for his own ends. He entered into secret negotiations with the Gothic chiefs and let them believe that this time he was ready to accept their offer to become Emperor of the West. It was a brilliant military deception, a pure stratagem. The Goths, believing him, ceased their resistance and opened the gates of Ravenna. In May of 540, Belisarius, at the head of his army, triumphantly entered the Gothic capital. As soon as the city was under his control, he immediately dropped the mask. He announced that he had acted in the name and on behalf of Emperor Justinian, arrested King Witiges and the entire Gothic nobility, and proclaimed Italy reunited with the empire. From a military standpoint, it was a masterpiece. He had taken an impregnable city without a single drop of blood, ending the war, as he thought, in one fell swoop. But from a political standpoint, it was a catastrophe. In Constantinople, his actions were interpreted in only one way. Belisarius had indeed been negotiating a seizure of power, and only something at the last moment made him change his mind. His enemies at court now had what they saw as irrefutable proof of his treason. Justinian's trust, already eroded, was completely shattered. This tactical triumph, which saved thousands of lives, turned into a strategic defeat for Belisarius, one that would ultimately cost him his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his sight. He had outsmarted the Goths, but he could not outsmart the paranoia of his master. While Belisarius waged wars on the battlefield, another, no less brutal war was unfolding in his own rear, in his family, and at court. A war of intrigue, jealousy, and betrayal. The central figure in this drama was his wife, Antonina. As a close friend of Empress Theodora, she wielded enormous influence and felt completely untouchable. According to Procopius's Secret History, Antonina was not only domineering, but also exceedingly promiscuous. Back in Constantinople, she had taken a lover, her adopted son named Theodosius. When Belisarius set out for the African campaign, she insisted on going with him and took Theodosius along. The whole army, according to Procopius, knew about the affair, and only Belisarius himself, blinded by love or fear, noticed nothing. This personal drama also had serious political consequences. Antonina, using her position, interfered in military affairs, appointing and dismissing commanders, creating tension in the general staff. Her connection with Theodora turned her into an unofficial overseer, an agent of the Empress in Belisarius's camp. Any move, any word from the general, was immediately known in the palace. The situation reached its peak during the Gothic War. Belisarius finally learned of his wife's infidelity and, according to rumor, flew into a rage, ordering his lover to be executed. But Antonina, through her agents, managed to contact Theodora. The Empress immediately intervened. She summoned several of Belisarius's loyal officers to Constantinople, accused them of conspiracy, and had them tortured and exiled. A clear message was sent to Belisarius himself. If he touched Antonina, he would face disgrace and ruin. The great general, before whom kings trembled, had to submit and publicly reconcile with his unfaithful wife. This episode, detailed by Procopius, became the apotheosis of his humiliation. It showed that despite all his victories, he remained merely a pawn in the hands of powerful women, weaving their web in the dark corridors of power. His family tragedy was inseparable from his political one, and each undermined the other, slowly destroying the foundations of his greatness. Justinian's reaction to the capture of Ravenna and the rumors of the crown was swift. The emperor, seized by fear and suspicion, immediately recalled Belisarius from Italy. The official pretext was the need for his presence on the eastern frontier, where the Persians had started another war. But the real reason was obvious to everyone. Justinian wanted to move the overly popular general far away from his loyal troops and the temptations of a Western crown. Belisarius was not even allowed to celebrate a triumph for the conquest of Italy. He was brought back to Constantinople almost as a disgraced nobleman. He brought the Gothic king Witiges and the treasures of Ravenna with him. But this time there were no adoring crowds, no gratitude from the emperor. Justinian received him coldly and immediately sent him to the Persian front. But humiliation awaited him there as well. Unlike previous campaigns, where he held full command, this time his authority was severely curtailed. He had to coordinate his actions with other commanders, many of whom were his secret detractors, who constantly sent slanderous reports to the capital. The campaign against the Persians under these conditions was sluggish and brought no resounding victories. This gave Belisarius's enemies at court a new reason for malice. They whispered to the emperor that his genius had faded, that he was not the man he used to be, that his successes in Africa and Italy had been a fluke. It was the slow, methodical destruction of his reputation. Justinian, who only saw the lack of brilliant victories, became more and more convinced of the truth of these slanders. The first recall from Italy was the beginning of the end. Belisarius transformed from an indispensable savior into one of many generals, from a shaper of destinies into a suspect whose every action was examined under a microscope. The empire still needed him, but the empire, in the person of its ruler, had already ceased to trust him. This gap between his real abilities and the level of trust in him would only grow, turning into an abyss that would eventually consume him. While Belisarius was fighting an inglorious war in the east, a catastrophe was unfolding in Italy, which he had left without strong leadership. The Goths, humiliated, but not broken, found a new leader. He was a young, energetic, and incredibly charismatic chief named Totila. He was the complete opposite of the indecisive Witiges. Totila possessed not only military talent, but also a gift for propaganda. He managed to rally the remnants of the Gothic nation, breathing new hope into them. He also pursued a shrewd social policy, winning over Italian peasants and even slaves by promising them freedom and land. The Byzantine garrisons, scattered across the peninsula, were small, and their commanders were mired in corruption and infighting. Totila began his counteroffensive, and it was stunningly successful. He crushed imperial detachments one after another, reconquering cities and provinces. His army grew daily. Soon, almost all of Italy, except for a few coastal fortresses, was back in Gothic hands. The pinnacle of his success was the recapture of Rome in 546. At first, Totila wanted to completely destroy the Eternal City, so that it would never again fall to the Imperials. But the persuasion of his advisors, and, according to some sources, a letter from Belisarius himself, made him abandon this barbaric plan. The news of the loss of Italy and Rome was a terrible blow to Justinian. Everything that Belisarius had conquered with such difficulty was lost in a matter of years. The restoration project was on the brink of total collapse. Totila's rebellion showed just how fragile the Byzantine conquests were, and how much everything depended on the genius of one man. By removing Belisarius, Justinian, as it turned out, had himself opened the gates for the enemy into the very heart of his dream. And now, standing on the edge of the abyss, he was forced to turn once again to the man he so feared and so distrusted. Faced with the complete collapse of his Italian policy, Justinian fell into despair. In Constantinople, everyone understood that there was only one person capable of fixing the situation: Belisarius. Under the pressure of public opinion and military necessity, the emperor was forced to reappoint his disgraced general as commander in Italy. However, this appointment was laden with so many humiliating conditions that it became a mockery. Justinian, still consumed by suspicion and, importantly, by imperial greed, refused to provide Belisarius with the necessary resources. He was given neither a proper army nor the money to hire mercenaries. In essence, he was sent to Italy with a small personal retinue and empty coffers. It was as if the emperor was telling him, "You think you're a genius? Then show me what you can do without my help." It was a mission doomed to fail from the start. Belisarius knew perfectly well that he was being sent to certain ruin, if not physical, then reputational. But he was a soldier. He accepted the order. In the year 544, he sailed to Italy for the second time. What he found there was a depressing picture. The remnants of the imperial troops were demoralized and had not been paid. The fortresses were in a deplorable state. Totila was master of the entire peninsula. Belisarius was trapped. He could not give the Goths a decisive battle due to a lack of troops. He could not hire new soldiers due to a lack of money. All he could do was wage a grueling guerrilla war, maneuvering between enemy armies, trying to hold on to a few port cities through which he could receive meager supplies. This was a shadow of the former general, a ghost of the Great War. Instead of blitzkriegs and grand sieges, there were minor skirmishes and desperate defenses. Justinian had placed his best general in a position where he could not win, perhaps secretly hoping that his final failure would forever rid the emperor of his overly bright shadow. The next 5 years, from 544 to 549, were a period of the deepest humiliation and powerlessness for Belisarius. The great general, the conqueror of continents, was reduced to the commander of a small partisan band, trapped in hostile territory. His main task was not conquest, but survival. He darted along the coast of Italy, from one port city to another, trying to somehow hinder the advance of Totila's armies. He showed miracles of resourcefulness and personal bravery, but he was powerless to change the overall strategic situation. The most dramatic episode of this period was his attempt to break the Gothic blockade of Rome. he equipped a flotilla and, under a hail of arrows, tried to force his way up the Tiber to deliver food to the besieged city. But due to the betrayal or indecisiveness of one of his commanders, who failed to carry out a diversionary attack, the operation failed at the very last stage. Rome fell before his eyes. In despair, Belisarius wrote one letter after another to Constantinople, pleading, demanding, appealing to Justinian's reason. He described the pitiful state of affairs, the lack of everything: soldiers, horses, weapons, money. He stated bluntly that without adequate reinforcements, further resistance was futile. But his letters either went unanswered or received vague promises that were never fulfilled. The court in Constantinople was deaf to his pleas. His enemies used this situation to tarnish his name completely. They presented the matter as if Belisarius were simply showing indecisiveness and had lost his former touch. These were 5 years of a slow, fading glory. Every day spent in Italy during this period was a blow to his pride and reputation. He, who was accustomed to winning, was forced to constantly retreat. He, who was accustomed to unquestioning obedience, saw his orders go unfulfilled for lack of resources. This was not just a military defeat, it was psychological torture, orchestrated by his own emperor. Eventually, even Justinian realized that the situation in Italy had become critical and required decisive action. However, instead of giving Belisarius the resources he had been requesting for 5 years, the emperor made a different, even more humiliating decision for his old general. He finally recalled him from Italy in 549. A few years later, having finally assembled a huge, well-equipped army and found the necessary funds, he sent it to conquer Italy. But at the head of this army, he placed not Belisarius. The new commander-in-chief was Narses, a court eunuch, treasurer, and confidant of the emperor. Narses was a capable administrator and a decent strategist, but he was no Belisarius. However, he had one undeniable advantage in Justinian's eyes. As a eunuch, he could never aspire to the throne. He was politically safe. Justinian trusted mediocrity without ambition more than genius with a potential threat. Narses, receiving everything that had been denied to Belisarius for years, an army, money, the full support of the court, marched into Italy and, in several decisive battles, crushed the Goths. In the Battle of Taginae in 552, Totila himself was killed. The Gothic resistance was broken. Narses finished what Belisarius had started, and it was he, not Belisarius, who received the glory for the final conquest of Italy. This was the last, crushing blow to Belisarius's pride. He wasn't just removed, he was replaced, and his replacement succeeded where he had been deliberately prevented from doing so. All of Byzantium saw the contrast. Belisarius had failed for 5 years, while Narses solved the problem in 2. Few considered that one had fought with his hands tied, while the other was given every advantage. In historical memory, Narses remained the victor of the Gothic War. The shadow of his success permanently eclipsed the figure of Belisarius, who was sent into undeserved retirement, forgotten, and it seemed no longer needed by anyone. Years passed. Belisarius lived a quiet life in Constantinople as a wealthy but retired nobleman. His fame had faded, and his deeds had become the stuff of history. It seemed his military career was over for good. But fate was preparing one last, most unexpected trial for him, and one final, most resounding triumph. In the year 559, a new disaster befell the empire. From the north, having crossed the frozen Danube, hordes of Kutrigor nomads invaded Byzantine territory. They were wild and fierce warriors who swept away everything in their path. They broke through all the defensive lines and, splitting into several detachments, rushed towards the very heart of the empire, Constantinople. Panic gripped the capital. There were virtually no regular troops in the city. All the armies were on the distant frontiers in Italy and Persia. The long walls of Theodosius, which protected the city from the land, were damaged in places by a recent earthquake. The aging Justinian, now in his 70s, was terrified. He ordered the palace guard and a citizen militia to man the walls, but everyone knew this was a weak defense against battle-hardened nomads. It seemed the magnificent city, the capital of the world, was doomed to be sacked. And at this moment of universal despair, someone remembered the forgotten hero. They remembered Belisarius. He was now nearly 60 and had not held a weapon in many years. But his name still possessed a magical power. Justinian, swallowing his pride and fear, summoned the old man and begged him to save the city. Belisarius, the faithful soldier, did not refuse. He accepted the command. He had no army. All they could give him were 300 veterans from his old guard, and a few thousand hastily armed peasants and citizens who had never seen battle. With this motley crew, he had to stop the invincible horde. What happened next became a legend, the last brilliant flash of a fading genius. Belisarius, despite his age and lack of resources, acted with the energy and cunning of a young commander. He understood that, in open battle, his militia would be instantly crushed by the professional Kutrigur cavalry. So once again, just as he had at Dara many years before, he relied on tactics and psychology. He led his army outside the city walls and positioned it in a narrow, wooded defile where the enemy cavalry could not deploy. To create the impression of a massive army, he ordered the peasants to cut branches and drag them behind them, raising huge clouds of dust. He also placed hunting horns and drums in the woods, which, on his signal, were to create a deafening noise. When the Kutrigur vanguard, confident of an easy victory, approached Belisarius's position, all hell broke loose. The dust prevented them from assessing the enemy's numbers, while the roar of horns and the beat of drums created the illusion that the main Byzantine army was approaching. At that moment, his 300 veterans, the only professional fist in his force, struck from ambush. The attack was so fierce and unexpected that the nomads, whose strength lay in shock and numbers, faltered. The panic that seized the forward detachments quickly spread to the rest. Convinced they had fallen into a well-organized trap and were facing the entire imperial army, the Kutrigurs turned and fled in a massive rout. The victory was complete. Belisarius, commanding a crowd of peasants, had routed an army that held the entire capital in terror, using only the force of his intellect and authority. He returned to Constantinople an absolute hero. The people once again carried him on their shoulders and composed songs of praise in his honor. He had saved the empire and his emperor one more time. He was the gray-haired lion who showed the world his claws and fangs one last time. The brief triumph of the old hero who saved the capital had, however, tragic consequences. Justinian's gratitude was short-lived, quickly replaced by a new, even stronger wave of envy and paranoia. The emperor, now nearing 80, was becoming increasingly suspicious and detached from reality. He saw the adoration with which the people treated Belisarius. He heard how the songs in the streets were not about the emperor's wisdom, but about his general's courage. In his senile mind, tormented by power, this popular worship once again transformed into the specter of a conspiracy. He could not understand or accept that a subject could be more popular than himself, the anointed of God. To him, this was a violation of the very order of the universe. Instead of showering Belisarius with honors and making him his chief advisor, Justinian began to see him as a threat. The general's final heroic act did not strengthen his position, but, on the contrary, completely undermined it. He had become too great, too legendary, to live out his days in peace. In the emperor's eyes, he was a living reproach, a constant reminder of who had truly saved the throne and the empire in its darkest hours. Justinian began to distance him, surround him with spies, and listen to any slander from his enemies, who were always plentiful at court. The atmosphere around Belisarius thickened. He, who had faithfully performed his duty to the end, found himself in a position where his greatest merit had become his greatest crime. He had saved Constantinople, but it was this very victory that signed his condemnation. The paranoid logic of autocracy demanded that a hero, having served his function, must either die or be humiliated, so that his glory would not cast a shadow on the throne. And Justinian, true to this ruthless logic, was already preparing the final, most vile blow against the man to whom he owed everything. The final act came in the year 562. Another conspiracy against the life of Emperor Justinian was uncovered at court. Such plots, real or imagined, were commonplace in Byzantine politics and served as a convenient pretext for eliminating undesirable individuals. Several officials were arrested. Under brutal torture, they began to give testimony, pointing fingers at each other and at increasingly high-ranking figures. And at some point, perhaps under pressure from interrogators who knew what the emperor wanted to hear, the name of Belisarius was spoken. One of the arrested men claimed that the old general was the secret mastermind and organizer of the entire plot. No real evidence of his guilt was ever presented. There were no letters, no witnesses to his participation in secret meetings. His entire previous life, filled with examples of unbending loyalty, screamed of his innocence. Any sane ruler would have considered such an accusation absurd. But Justinian was not sane. He was an old, frightened tyrant who had lived for decades in fear of his general's popularity. This accusation was exactly what he had been waiting for, what he had subconsciously desired. It gave him a formal reason to destroy the man whose greatness oppressed him. The web of lies was woven, and the victim was chosen. For Justinian, this was the perfect opportunity. He didn't want to simply execute Belisarius. That might have sparked a revolt in the army and among the people. He wanted to humiliate him, to trample his name, to erase him from history as a traitor. The charge of high treason was the perfect instrument for this. The fate of Belisarius was decided not in a courtroom, but in the dark chambers of the imperial palace, in the soul of the man whose empire he had built and saved. The trial of Belisarius was a farce, a parody of justice. Despite the complete lack of evidence, he was found guilty of conspiracy. However, Justinian, as planned, did not sentence him to death. He chose a punishment that, in the eyes of a Roman, was perhaps even more terrifying than death. It was a civil execution, the complete and total annihilation of his person. By the court's verdict, Belisarius was stripped of all his ranks and titles. His entire vast fortune, lands, palaces, gold, accumulated over decades of campaigns and earned with blood, was confiscated by the state. He, one of the wealthiest men in the empire, became a pauper overnight. He was placed under house arrest in his now former palace, with guards posted. His numerous servants and veterans who made up his retinue were dismissed. He was completely isolated from the world, deprived of everything that had constituted his life and status. It was absolute humiliation. The man who had brought 2 kings to the emperor's feet and returned entire provinces to the empire was declared a traitor and stripped bare by his own master. Justinian had achieved his goal. He did not make Belisarius a martyr. He made him a laughingstock, a pathetic old man deprived of everything. This image of a broken and disgraced hero was meant to serve as a lesson to anyone who might dare to acquire too much glory in the future. The emperor showed that he alone was the source of all power and all wealth, and that he could take it all away at any moment. The civil execution of Belisarius became the apotheosis of ingratitude, the highest point of paranoia that absolute power can reach. He was erased from public life, his name covered in shame. It seemed that his story had ended there, ingloriously. A few months later, in early 563, something strange happened. Justinian suddenly pardoned Belisarius. Perhaps his conscience troubled him, or perhaps he feared the people's anger, which, despite everything, had not subsided. Or maybe he simply decided that his victim had been sufficiently humiliated. The charges against Belisarius were dropped, his freedom was restored, and even a portion of his confiscated property was returned. But it was a belated and empty mercy. The great general was broken not physically, but morally. The shame he had endured, the betrayal by the emperor he had served his entire life, and the realization of the utter futility of his loyalty had crushed his spirit and his health. He lived for only a few months after his pardon and died quietly in March of that year. Justinian outlived him by only 8 months. It was on this real ground, immense glory, an unjust accusation, a humiliating disgrace, and a sudden pardon just before death, that the famous legend of the blind beggar Belisarius grew. Historical sources do not confirm that he was actually blinded and sent to beg for alms. It is most likely a later exaggeration, a literary fiction. But this fiction turned out to be truer than historical fact. The popular consciousness, unsatisfied with a prosaic ending, created a more powerful, more tragic image that perfectly reflected the essence of what had happened. The blinding became a metaphor for the blindness of justice itself and the blind ingratitude of power. The alms bowl became a symbol of how the empire repaid its savior. The legend of the hero who gave everything to the state, being forced to beg for charity from that same state, became the perfect artistic conclusion to his life, the ultimate expression of the injustice committed against him. This story, though not factually accurate in its details, became immortal precisely because it takes the central paradox of his fate to its absolute conclusion. The death of Belisarius did not end his story. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of his immortality in human memory. His image, refracted through the prism of the legend of the blind beggar, transformed into an eternal archetype, a universal symbol that different eras interpreted in their own way. For some, he became the embodiment of the ideal soldier and loyal subject, a model of stoic service to duty despite all betrayals and injustices. His unbending loyalty to Justinian, even when offered a crown, was seen as the highest virtue, an example for all warriors and statesmen. For others, his fate became a dire warning. Enlightenment philosophers like Montesquieu saw in his story a stark example of the corrupting influence of despotism. In their eyes, Belisarius was a tragic victim of tyranny, a genius destroyed by the paranoia of an absolute monarch. His story proved that in a system where one man rules, no amount of merit can protect against the whims of power. This image inspired artists and writers. The painting, Belisarius Begging for Alms, by Jacques-Louis David, became a manifesto of neoclassicism, calling for civic virtues and condemning monarchical injustice. He became the hero of numerous novels, plays, and operas, where his personal drama was used to explore timeless questions about power, loyalty, human nature, and the vicissitudes of fate. His legacy turned out to be as dual as Procopius's accounts of him. He is both a role model and a tragic lesson. His life, full of incredible victories and crushing humiliations, became for subsequent generations not just a page from a history textbook, but a profound parable about the relationship between genius and power, the individual and the system. And this parable remains relevant to this day, forcing us to reflect on the price of glory and the nature of gratitude. And so, we return to the central question posed at the very beginning. Why did the last Roman, the savior of the empire, the greatest general of his time, end his journey in humiliation, giving rise to the legend of a blind beggar? The answer is multi-layered and cannot be reduced to a single cause. Belisarius did not fall simply because of Justinian's betrayal or Theodora's intrigues. His tragedy was systemic. It was embedded in the very nature of the political reality in which he lived. First, it was a tragedy of absolutism. In a system where all power is concentrated in the hands of one person, anyone else who becomes too popular, too successful, automatically becomes a threat. Every victory for Belisarius, every cheer from the crowd in his honor, was a blow to Justinian's pride and sense of security. The emperor needed his victories, but feared their consequences. Belisarius was too good for his own safety. Second, it was a tragedy of Belisarius's own character. His greatest virtue, an absolute, almost naive loyalty, proved to be his fatal flaw in the world of Byzantine politics. He was a Roman republican in spirit, serving the abstract idea of the state, while the court lived by the laws of personal devotion and backroom struggles. He did not build his own faction, seek allies, or try to politically secure his successes. He just fought, believing that his loyalty and his victory spoke for themselves. He failed to understand that, in this system, loyalty without flattery and success without political cover provoke not gratitude, but suspicion. Third, there was undoubtedly the role of court intrigues, in which women, his own wife Antonina and Empress Theodora, played a key role. They drew him into a world whose rules he did not understand, and his dependence on their patronage made him vulnerable. Thus, his fall was the result of a clash between his personality and his era. He was a man from another, simpler, more heroic world, caught in the complex and venomous atmosphere of the Byzantine court. He was the perfect sword, but its owner feared that one day that sword might turn against him. And so, in the end, he chose to break it. Ultimately, the story of Belisarius goes far beyond the biography of one man. It becomes a universal parable about the nature of glory and the burden it imposes. In a world of absolute power, glory is not a reward, but an ordeal, often a fatal one. It is like the sun, which, while giving light and warmth, can also scorch anyone who flies too close. Belisarius spent his life trying to serve the light of the empire, but he himself became so bright that he began to cast a shadow on the source of that light, the emperor. And the system could not tolerate it. His fate is an eternal reminder that the greatest human virtues, talent, genius, valor, and even devotion, can, under certain conditions, be perceived as a threat and become the cause of one's downfall. The story of Belisarius teaches us a bitter lesson. Sometimes, in order to survive, a hero must cease to be a hero, must learn to be inconspicuous, to temper his zeal, to compromise. But Belisarius was incapable of this. He was a man of integrity, a soldier to the core, and he did not know how to be anyone else. Therein lies his greatness and his tragedy. He remained the last of the true Romans to the end, but the world around him had long since ceased to be Rome. He restored the physical borders of the empire, returning its lands and cities, but he could not change its soul, already poisoned by fear, suspicion, and the boundless thirst for absolute power. And in the end, that soul devoured him. The legend of the blind beggar asking for alms is not just a story of one emperor's ingratitude. It is a profound philosophical symbol of the futility of serving a power that fears its own shadow. It is a tale of how a system, created to maintain order, destroys its best sons out of fear of their greatness, leaving behind only the ashes of triumphs and the eternal question of the price of loyalty.